is the Integrative Awareness Coach, and I'm here today to share with you episode 99 of the Lifting the Veil podcast. It is a weekly podcast I produce, and this week's topic is around healing the integrity of the self and how this is particularly related to healing our sexuality, which is deeply connected to life force itself. And this is what fuels our passions and desires, our dreams, our wishes, and how we move in the world, which is essential at this time where we are being tasked as a collective with a particular approach to transforming our world that is in the process of unfolding as we move forward. And the mind, our beautiful mind, likes to have plans and blueprints and everything built before we move forward. But unfortunately, that mode of operation is not what is going to take us forward in this next step of our quantum evolution. So these are some of the topics that I want to share with you today. I haven't really come up with a name for this week's episode. Sometimes I need to record it first before the title arises, one that's able to hold the clarity of the topic or topics being shared. So I want to start off with talking about the healing taking place around our life energy. And there's been many names for this in many different traditions. For example, in the yogic tradition, it's referred to the Shakti, the Kundalini. Christianity, we could refer to this as the Holy Spirit, the breath of life, prana, chi. In Greek mythology, we could call this Eros. Astrology, this is connected to Mars, that drive that moves us forward in life. And I want to talk about what's happening with this central expression and the healing that's unfolding around our life force and what we're being called into. So there's many different ways I could make my way into this topic. So I am going to freestyle it right now. And I am just calling in whatever wants to be spoken through me at this time, realizing that it's for the best and highest good for all people that will be listening to this, either on recording. Well, it's all on recording because this is not a live podcast at this moment. So with that being said, when we think about this life energy that we have surging through our body that we call our vitality and our energy, we have through our mental structures, our mental lenses, have been using it in a particular way. And I like to use the metaphor of Mars. For the last, thousands of years in our human evolution, we have been experiencing the individualization of this life force to the point where we are now, many of us, largely in our world, see ourselves as individualized and separate from everyone else. And this was a part of the experience of being human. And while there's beauty in individualized expression, and the experience taught consciousness, human consciousness, so much about individualized separation in order for us to know the difference. And so this individualization through this energy I'm calling Mars, at least in a astrological perspective, was based on self and other, which included defensiveness, which was a part of our developing survival mind, that began to see a separation between subject to object, created a lot of armoring in the body, in the psyche, where I'm identified with my perception of reality. And if anyone comes counter to that, my brain sees it as a threat to self. But what we're being called to at this time is an evolution in how we not only define the self, but how the self is related to consciousness, so that we can design a future that is viable and can allow our species to continue to develop and grow in cooperation and collaboration with the planet that we live on. Now, this individualization was taken to such a degree that the human figure began to see itself separate than the earth, when in actuality our entire physical makeup is earth itself. We are earth, and we are filled with a energy, a spirit of life that has given animation to these bodies that are made of minerals and everything that's the planet is made of at this time. So this is related to taking that drive, that energy that moves us from a very limited perspective of me, myself, and I, and then everybody else, into a expansive landscape of what science in regards to quantum physics has shown is a field of consciousness itself, and that our experience is actually unfolding in this, let me just say, our context, like our perspective of how we see ourselves in the world, whether it's partial, and when I say partial, it's just a living out of the perspective of I am a isolated I, is actually creating my reality. And so if this is the case, then instead of defining ourselves as separate from, we are being called to begin to reimagine ourselves as not separate from, but uniquely individualized in the whole, like the body, the cell in each body. In our bodies, for example, there's thousands and billions and millions of cells, and they're all individual, and they all hold a unique role in the body's health and wholeness, and they all have a job to do for the greater good of the body. And it's almost like all of us little cells are starting to realize that this vision of the world we had as separate, where our actions we didn't have to really think about our actions in regard to our relationship, our interrelatedness, in the sanctity of a community, because a lot of that has been removed and erased. And this is part of the breakdown that's happening for so many people. And it materialized and manifested as a disease or a virus of the immune system, of health itself, of life force itself. And so, with that being said, that was consciousness, divine intelligence, source, whatever you want to call it, this self-organizing principle that expresses itself through all of creation, including me and you, waking itself up to a larger reality of what's available. And so if we want to use these traditional archetypes, for example, as I mentioned, Mars is driving through life, the individual will is driving through life with a partial perspective of who it is not in service of the whole, because it doesn't even recognize that it's part of the whole. And so what is becoming available is a reconciliation to where the body, the mind, and the heart, all three aspects of our being, are becoming to work and move in unison. And this is the integrity of the new self that's emerging, that has been missing through the Mars perspective. And this is where we come to what has been called the wounded healer, or Chiron. And the wounded healer, part of the evolution of the wounded healer, is recognizing that the wound comes from its partial perspective. The wound comes from self-delusion, of not recognizing the fullness of the construction of what it really is. And that when the self is removed or given partial access to the fullness of its design, it creates delusion, it creates illness, it creates pain, it creates suffering, because we have this separated ego self working against life itself, thinking that it's somehow separate or in opposition to, when it's actually one with. And so at this moment, it has come to my attention through all of the work that I do, whether it's my own personal work or work I do with people that I coach, is that there is a huge opportunity to start elevating I should say, shifting our center of gravity in which we operate from. When we step back into the integrity of the fullness of our being, that becomes our reconnection to all that is. And it is that reconnection which is our source. It is our food. It is the light of creation itself that begins to shine through us. And when we are reunited with that integrity of our soul, we are reunited with the truth of who we are. And then our mode of action in the world, our mode of moving forward, our will, if you will, is reinformed. And I use those words intentionally, reinformed, of the whole mechanism of what it means to be a human on this planet. And that when we are in integrity with our natural design, before the mind separated itself in delusion, before it started seeing itself as a partial aspect of what it was intended to be, then we begin to move from a place, a true place of our situatedness, of interconnectivity in the sanctity of community, because we realize our position in it for perhaps the first time in all of creation, this level of awakening that's happening. And it is this level of awakening that is allowing all of these three parts of our body to come back in unison, into harmony, which is wholeness, which is health, which is allowing that life force to be healed, to be returned to the body, to be infused in it. And this is taking Mars to a higher octave. So the will is no longer functioning in an individualized, separated state, and is realizing its true condition as Eros, which is connected love that's in service of all. Likewise, not only have we had a wounded will, inability to fully express the potential at the level in which we were intended, we've also had a wounded psyche. And the psyche in Greek means the soul. And if you're familiar with Greek mythology, you know that Eros and Psyche were in love. They are the fundamental aspects of creation. And we find this in many traditions. Shakti and Shiva, Christ and the Holy Spirit, or the Mary, let's say. And if we don't have these two parts of ourselves, we're operating out of incomplete or partial consciousness that is available. And instead of having that feminine aspect of us, also known as Venus in the material world, she is in charge of love and beauty and aesthetics at a very materialistic plane, which the expression of feminism, feminine, has been reduced to, the over sexualization of the body, particularly the feminine body, not realizing that it is a container for the soul itself, and that what is really contained in that desire of the wounded masculine as Mars, that craving of that physical possession or consumption of the feminine body, let's say, is an attempt of the separated mind to be fulfilled, to be fulfilled, to be completed, to be all that it is. Except this material expression is only one part of who we are. And it is the outcome of the creative force, which is the feminine. And so it's like trying to create something that's already in the past, already in the rearview mirror. And so it's like looking for life in death. And what I'm saying is, it's like the mind looks in the wrong place for that fulfillment, for that food, for that nutrients, for that nourishing food, which cannot be found in any physical consumption, whether it's how much money we have or how much beautiful things we possess, how much power we have, how much money we have. It's never lasting. And this is part of the pull of the awakening to to become aware that there's something much more, like all of that's good, right? But there's something much more nutritious waiting for us. And that when we raise Venus to the highest octave, she becomes the soul, which is expression of source in the body. But when the soul is misidentified as the physical realm, that's the wound for her. That is the ever eating and never being fulfilled, wanting to consume ourselves into fulfillment. But the body can never reach that level. And so we're all being called to raise to this highest octave of not only our will, but the spirit that feeds that will, that works together in a marriage. And historically, this has been defined as masculine and feminine energy. Not that this is reduced to gender, but is energy, types of energy that we can begin to learn to work with consciously on purpose. Now, I'm going to bring this home to a more, material 3D world example, because it's really nice to talk about these etherical qualities, but how do they show up in our everyday interactions and our lives? And how do they honestly affect us emotionally? Like, what are the ramifications for us emotionally? What is the outcome for others and the suffering and the price that has been paid unconsciously, right? And there's no judgment. There's nothing bad or good. It's just an opportunity to learn and grow and evolve. So there's no really good guys or bad guys. There's simply a recognition of our role in perpetuating ways of being that might be less than fulfilling. So I want to talk about this life energy that has often reduced to sexual expression. And, I started this episode out probably about 2 weeks ago, and I posted it, and then I took it down because I didn't feel that I had really hit what I was trying to get at. I had just begun, and because it's a deep topic, right? It's not something simple or light or easily understood at first glance. And so I used the word sex in the title. And I was really, really torn about using that title because I know that the minute I use the word sex in the title, people will click on it. Just because it has the word sex and they'll like that. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying that I'm not going to use that in the title, but it is just extremely interesting how charged. I bring this to your attention because I want to share with you and bring into awareness how charged the idea of sex is for people. And I want to talk a little bit about that and why. And I want to start off by saying I think it's charged because it is pure life energy. And when it's been reduced to a very small container of sexual expression, although sexual expression doesn't have to be small, I'm not saying that, but that is the extent in which it is recognized for reproduction, pleasure of the physical body, then it's reduced to something that could be actually so much more life affirming on so many levels. And I want to share with you about that today. And so, for many people, and for a great number of women, there's a lot of trauma, sexual trauma, trauma around sex. I haven't checked the recent statistics, but last I did, they say 1 of every 3 girls is sexually molested. And I believe it was 1 in 5 boys. But these numbers tend to be underreported because there's so much silence and shame and guilt around sex itself. And these are all areas that are in the process of they're going to have to be pulled up, purified, and brought to light because there's so much misunderstanding, false information, inaccurate information, no information, unconsciousness around it. So I broke it down into 3 parts. And the first part is what I call social conditioning. The second part is what I'm calling the reception. And the third part is the outcome. So I want to talk about how these energies have shown up in our collective reality, just to provide some awareness about how you might be relating to your own sexuality, which is life force itself, and how the reduction or the funneling down of sexual expression as an expression of life source is been a disservice for many of us, which has driven people to all sorts of addictions and obsessions and violence and misuse of life force itself, and the sexual abuse and trauma of countless children and women. So when you think about why this is, why there's so much trauma around sex, and then its relationship to why there's so much trauma around and inability to recognize the self and what it is as an expression of life force. And for me, trauma is another word for a wounding around the self, around the will, around the ability to liberate one's self. And this often reverberates around the entire idea of the self-image, our sense of self, and our ability to relate to ourselves, our level of freedom, our ability to give and receive love, and how to do that in a way that feels safe in our bodies. So a lot of this has to do with the Mars conditioning of self and other. So for example, if you are naked in a room with another person, it's extremely vulnerable, no? And of course, this serves as a minefield or a free-for-all on one level for what's under the water line of consciousness, let's say. including all of our associations with our body, our safety, our attachment wounds to our caregivers, everything we inherited about sex and love and desire, including the guilt and the shame, the confusion, the hurt, the contradictions that we all bring with us from the past into every present moment, whether we're conscious of it or not. And when we meet another person who's carrying all of their unconscious baggage together, there is bound to be some misfortune, let's say, or some hurt, some lack of connection, almost the opposite of what the promise of truly embodied lovemaking is about. And so much so that individuals actually are often not able to be present in their body emotionally. So, if, for example, in America, if you are from America and you can compare this to wherever you're at in the world, receive little or no sexual education around sex, let alone love or child rearing, where many children are educated unconsciously by the media. And now we have the internet and the world of pornography that is feeding this image of what sexuality is, and then a silence of the adults around them. And just as a case in point, for example, in my sex education was shaped by parental silence and, ironically, the sexual molestation I suffered from my uncle when I was about 5 years old, and then the instability that created for me emotionally and psychologically, that put me in a position to be raped when I was 14, repetitively, and somehow I imagined that this was an expression of romantic love, but I didn't even know what that was. And so I was in a and I had nobody to talk to, no resources. I was in a self-referential, self-referring hall of mirrors of what's the matter with me, why isn't this working, what am I missing? And there was so much confusion around what authentic love was and how it was related to sex, and the realization that they aren't necessarily ever even related, in the case of rape, for example. And so, with this little experience growing up, as probably many of you may have experienced as well, how can you be authentically and fully embodied in your self expression, your love, your choice, your freedom, and these trauma patterns, which are misinformation pressed onto life and stored in the body at the most tender, energetic, impressionable ages, at least for me. I wasn't able to share it with anybody. There was nobody else. There was nobody to help me. There was no resources around me, and I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm simply stating my experience and how it set me up for a whole waterfall of misperception, which creates misconnection, or inauthentic connection, or a false sense of self. And all of this is so related because it's connected to the most basic things, which are our life force. And what I'm wanting for you to note in this story is to illustrate that my experience around sex isn't unique, and it's deeply related to my self-perception, my sense of power in the world. I guess that's really what I'm wanting to communicate. So underneath all of this is how these things, these physical expressions, are connected to our basic emotional and psychological needs, that are related to this self, and how this wounding occurs on so many levels. And when I say wounding, it's an incomplete mirror of who one is. And I don't want to say it's instigated through sex. These sexual templates, for lack of a better word, are kind of a reflection of our inability to truly connect with the power of who we are as a life force, in the sanctity of our interrelatedness, in a way that's respectful not only to ourself but to others, and the unconsciousness that's related to and that particularly is notable in sexual relationships, and a deep level of disconnection and disassociative states that allow for and create these types of destructive and inappropriate expressions of care. And what does it actually mean to be cared for? And I just want to give a example. So recently I was watching this documentary about Pamela Anderson, and it really resonated with me because she was a caricature of what our culture has defined as feminine allure and desire and beauty, with no soul. Not that she didn't have a soul, but the image that was sold, and the preoccupation with imagery. And she shared that she was sexually abused by a babysitter when she was, I don't remember, 4 or 5. And then she was raped when she was 12, and then again when she was 14. And this pattern of stealing people's innocence as a sort of sexual gratification and rite of passage, in a way, I guess, is what it's looked at. But then she goes to Hollywood. She gets sucked up into this machine, and she learns how to use her exploitation for her own material gain. It's almost like she learns how to exploit herself for her own interests. And some people say, well, that's smart, you know. At least she took control of her own exploitation. She participated in it, because, you know, that's what the world's going to do anyway, right? And so it's really another aspect of what's happening is this feminine is being called to the position of spiritual warrior, and not in the way that you think of when you think of a warrior, but as in traditional, like, hero goes off to fight a war, but a spiritual warrior, one that stands in the fullness of the health and is no longer culpable or colluding with this half version of our humanity, where the payoff is sexual gratification, which is never enough, right? You just look at the OnlyFans website where you have millions, who even knows, billions of largely men, I don't want to say it's all men, paying money to have a relationship with a screen. And that total disembodiment and disconnection from their own sexuality that's occurring. And that the disassociation of like, oh, I would rather connect with a screen than a real human being, or I haven't really been able to connect with a human being because I don't know how, right? Because I was never taught. So it's much easier to deal with images in my mind. Like that's the level of intimacy that I'm connecting with. And the starvation, like the consumption, and the other side of that is the starvation, because it's not truly ever feeding the soul in which it really craves. And there's a difference between being in the body, being sensual, and being sexual. And then what happens when you are sensual and sexual, and that there's an ownership of that, and there's ability to be present with that, which creates a sacred space, a third space, which is sacred, in which life energy becomes honored, respected, and in its integrity. And that's when I say in its integrity, it's being recognized not just as a material expression of momentary pleasure, but actually as an expression of life energy that can't be stopped below the waist. It's actually the place that moves us through life and gives us our being. And for many of us, we've been cut off from that level of spirituality because it's been connected with a church, it's been connected with a dogma, it's been connected with abusive power, and yet we're still left with the abuse of this wonderful gift that we've been given called life. And unless we can rebalance this three-part construction of self, there will be pathology in the expression of it that is not fulfilled. And when it is not fulfilled, it goes into opposition to life. Life gets turned upon itself and it begins to destroy itself. And we see that. And it's like what we're doing to our planet right now. Consciousness is destroying the very place in which it lives because it can't wake up. It is waking up. It's happening. I don't mean to say that it's not. But the pain of separation of this automatized self has to become so great that consciousness has to look outside of itself for something more palatable, something more fulfilling, something more wholesome or healthy. And so this isn't a judgment about how isn't intended to create more guilt or shame or humiliation around sex. It's to free it from all of that so it can be seen in the fullness of what it was intended for. And so a lot of this is below the threshold of our conscious mind. And, it's different depending on the stage of development of where you are at as a human being. But working through sexual abuse myself, working with others who have experienced sexual abuse, our sexuality is contained in our physical body, our sensuality. But our sensuality is not the same as sexuality. So, for example, Um, when a woman who has been abused can engage in the sexual act, it doesn't mean she's in the sensuality of her body. A lot of sexual abuse trauma, people that have experienced trauma report not being able to feel their body, not being able to feel safe in their body during sex. They're disassociated and they're not in the stream of their own life. So, what happens when somebody's taken out of their own body because it's too distressing to their organism? And this disassociation from the body during sex is what's needing to be healed, not to have more sex, but yes, if you want, but to recreate that sacredness in which it was intended. So you can't have a fully embodied sexual experience if you're not able to be in the sensuality of your body, which creates a sacred space for the entirety of your life force and your experience. And so why are we having to cut off? Why are people having to cut off from their life experience? So while the physical body might be acting out the sexual act, and even experiencing the sensual aspect of it, they might not, for example, for many men, can't be emotionally present in their body. And as a career, as a healer and a coach and a teacher, I've become deeply familiar with these states of what happens, for example, when someone comes to see me for a healing practice or energy healing. What happens is opening up that sacred space for their life energy to feel safe enough to come back into their body, which is the actual healing process. So, really, it's when consciousness witnesses another consciousness in unconditional love, right? Without judgment, simply witnessing life unfold. Then the restriction can fall away, the clutching, the armoring, the fear. And so it is in that sacredness of that connection which allows life to rush back in, which creates healing. And a lot of the trauma that keep people out of their body is related to the misuse of this sexual energy. And so it has to do with a certain state of mind. And it has to do with being energetically connected with another in a way that recognizes the depth of another's humanity. So if a person is wounded and they approach you and their wound only allows them to see you as object, there's no way they can connect with you on an energetic, emotional, or, for example, sensual level, because it's not safe. They got that turned off. And so, in addition to, these three levels I'm talking about are all part of our humanity, and they're not specifically related to sex, but to the wholeness of who we are. The sexuality, the energy running through our body, the sensuality, being able to be present in one's body, to fully witness life moving through you. And then the sacred space that is built out of that. And all of these are meshed in one another. They're not necessarily distinct, but yes, they can be. And it's through holding space for that body or that nervous system that allows it to realign, to energetically come back online with its own intelligence within and heal itself. And nobody can do this for another. No doctor, right? It has to be the intelligence within the body is what heals itself when it's flowing through the body as the way it was intended. So I see that when somebody comes to me and they have a freeze or fight or flight pattern in their body, which most people do, stuck energy in the nervous system, unprocessed emotional or psychic energy in their systems. When you become highly attuned to that, attuned to your own energy, including my own energetic boundaries that provide a safe space for people that may have never ever actually experienced that before in their life because it wasn't allowed. For example, empaths or sensitives learn to carry the weight of other people's emotions and psychic energy. For example, in my family, I was trained to do that, very codependent use of my life energy, but it was unconscious and it was what was required in order to feel safe in my family, in my home. And it is this imprinting, this sense of self is deeply embodied and sensual. And this is where it becomes very sticky, let's say. Because if I have dysfunctional patterns, they become enmeshed in dysfunction, dysfunctional images of love, dysfunctional images of sexual connection. And then they are related to desire and love at the deepest level, even though, right, with the central experience of being aroused, even though they might not actually be that thing, actually be that experience, but it's like a counterfeit experience. And I know that pulling one's self out of that dysfunction, out of that miswiring and that misfiring, that creates like a constant opposition to the truth of life force, which is wanting to connect, which is wanting to feel safe, which is wanting to be embodied, which is wanting to be fully experienced. How can you even know what that feels like if you've never ever had it modeled or know that it's even available for you? So I want to talk more about this, but I don't think that I'm going to be able to fit this all in. I see that I've already been talking for quite a while. So I think this is going to be part 1 of this episode on sexuality and the self. And I will record part 2 for next week because it's a very rich, in-depth subject. And I want to bring it back home, back to how do we go from using this individualized perspective of the self through the Mars and Venus lens and all of the dysfunction that's hardwired into the body. And when I say dysfunction, I mean improperly misidentified. Sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors here. Misidentified or partial view of this life energy that we have, whatever you want to, whatever name you have for it, life force, prana, Shakti, you name it. It's had many names. And at this time, it's the return of that into the fullness of who we are. So next week, in part 2 of this episode, I will talk, that was social conditioning. And in the next episode, I believe it will be episode 100, I'll be talking about reception and what was the third part that I said? Sorry. The reception and the outcome. That's what it was. And so I want to bring us back full circle to how can we get there? And not in a place where, like an end, but as a means of living a more fulfilled, fully embodied, expressed, joyful life, including our vitality and our health and the wisdom and intelligence that is our birthright. And how can we move through all of the miswiring and the misfiring and use that as a tool for self-awareness and self-recognition of the entirety of who we are. And once we do that, we get to see that available for other people. And when we become a witness for that for ourselves, we automatically become a witness for that for other people to step into their fullness of their being in a way that is nourishing to their humanity, that's an integrity, that allows them to step into their purpose in a deep, meaningful way, that erases any imposter syndrome, any self-hatred, any self-judgment, self-rejection, self-hatred, all of the things that are a result of misdirected life energy. So I hope you found something of value for yourself this week. And if you did, please leave an emoji, leave a comment, say hi, let me know what resonated with you and why. It will help me inform my next part 2 of this, as well as future talks. And I do have a goal, as I've mentioned before, for this year 2023 to raise my listenership to 10,000 listeners. So if you feel called, please share. You're also welcome to donate. If you heard something valuable, it helped me continue doing this weekly podcast. Until next time, please remember what a valuable treasure you are. And if you'd like to find out more about my work, you can check out my website at www.mindheart-space.com. And I will also put the link to my calendar if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one. I know there's all sorts of conditions that arise out of this unrecognized life force that cause people a lot of suffering and a lot of pain, causes people to self-sabotage, throw themselves under the bus, throw their entire lives out because they're trying to get away from the discomfort. And I know how challenging it can be because, let's face it, I've been there and I've helped a lot of people as well move through it. So I just wanted to share that with you. Until next time, take care and bye for now.